Bruce, so glad to connect with you, man. And I know you've been interviewed on CNN and the New York Times, and this definitely isn't that. It's it's actually better because it's two surfers talking about Teahupoo and Epic Break. I wanted to start with where you learned to surf and kind of where you grew up.
So I actually started surfing in the UK in North Cornwall, as you can probably guess from my accent.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of work with entry level surfers, but I was actually coaching some competitive level surfers as well. And the reason that Surf Simply ended up coming about was because I was just really interested in how there was this coaching available for entry level and competitive surfers, like the bottom and top 1%, but not really the 98% of people who fall within that. And plus, I have a slightly sort of obsessively curious personality, and I was just really interested in trying to create a methodology that actually systematically, consistently could draw a tree of skills that connected point A to point B. And that's kind of what Surf Simply has become now. It's been running for 17 years, and we actually have that tree of knowledge, as we call it, in relief in one of the coaching rooms at our resort in Costa Rica. Yeah. I sort of skipped ahead a little bit there, but yeah.
No, that's great because I wanted to talk about that because it's like a high-tech university from what my research found, and the resort looks amazing. So those of you out there, check out surfsimply.com. Especially if you have, I'll say, that kind of budget, it's upper end, but I think it's well worth it for what you receive back in video instruction, coaching, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's not an inexpensive week, but I think that it is really good value. We generally get full about 6 to 12 months in advance throughout the year. And, more than half the people that come back. So I think they feel like it's good. And, the reason it's quite an expensive week primarily is because we have a team of coaches who've made it their career choice to dedicate their professional adult lives to being professional surf coaches, which actually is why I ended up moving to Costa Rica. Because when you're doing something like this somewhere that's seasonal, it's very difficult for people that could be doing anything to justify financially being a professional surf coach for their whole lives. So by being in Costa Rica, we can be open year round and pay the team year round and kind of make that work. So I think people are pretty pleased, and I think it's taken a long time for people to actually have confidence in, as an intermediate surfer, which is what most of our guests are, to have confidence that they can come along and are actually going to get real value out of the coaching. Because I think a lot of coaching has just been primarily for entry-level surfers, and intermediate surfers dip their toe in the water and then they're like, all right, I can stand up and now I'm not really getting much value out of this. But most of what we do is video coaching, and most of our guests, we do look after entry-level surfers, but most of our guests have been surfing for 10 or 20 years, which is very gratifying because that was really the aim of the project.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of us out there that want to improve our surfing even as we get older. And I wanted to switch from that paradise to the other paradise, and I think that maybe Tahiti came along as a tech scout for Surf Simply, or you just want to enjoy yourself. But tell us about the little town at the end of the road and just the vibe there.
It's one of my favorite places to go. I've done a couple of trips there recently. About 10 years or so ago, my dad had cancer, and I was with him through those last days of that, and I suddenly was like, why am I putting these things off? And going to Tahiti was something I'd always wanted to do. I think a lot of people have that experience around my age. And so I went there as a competent surfer, but definitely not a pro level surfer, and definitely not a big wave surfer. And I hadn't been scared in the ocean for as long as I could remember. And I remember having a thought on the plane on the way there, thinking, maybe I just don't get scared anymore. Maybe that's just, behind me. And then I saw one set roll through at Chopo, and I was like, oh yeah, I get scared. Yeah, I absolutely get scared. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about first the boards that you took or the boards that you take to surf that wave.
So you actually generally don't need huge boards. It's such a small takeoff spot that being in the right place and, of course, picking the right wave is much more important than having the paddle power to get over the ledge. And actually, I took my usual shortboard is about 5'10", and I had a 5'10" and like a 6'0" and a 6'2".
Yeah.
And on some of the slightly bigger days, we're talking paddling surfing, not toe surfing. I didn't go near it on the toe days.
Right.
But paddling surfing, I'd go out on my bigger board, and I actually broke this most recent trip, broke both my bigger boards on the first day of a big swell. And then I ended up riding my 5'10", and it made no difference at all. It was all about being in the right spot, because that wave stands up so quickly out of nothing. The thing that really surprised me from having seen it on television to actually being in the water when you're there is that you sort of have this feeling that it's kind of like maybe Cloudbreak or Macaronis or one of these classic point breaks where you've got this channel and you can always just escape into the channel if you can just get down the line enough. But what suddenly is very apparent to you in the water is that at the end of that wave that you see is a huge closeout. So as you look down on it, what you're really looking at is a big horseshoe shaped closeout where one bit of it happens to break last. So as you take off on that wave and you're looking down the line, you're looking at essentially a big closeout coming towards you. And when you see people kick off the back, if they keep going and don't kick out, they're not going into nice, flat, calm water where the boat is sitting. You're going into an even heavier wave than the one you just surfed that's kind of folding over, well, depending on the stage of the tide, sometimes completely dry reef. And that was a real shock to me. I've surfed at a lot of left-hand reef breaks in Indonesia and Fiji before, and I hadn't quite got my head around that before. And you find yourself on the inside, and in a lot of those other kind of left-hand reef breaks or right-hand reef breaks, you just paddle wide and you paddle for the channel, and that's the safe zone. And at Teahupoo, you can't do that because you paddle that way to the channel, and then there's just this closeout there that's even scarier than the takeoff spot. So you can find yourself paddling for the channel, and almost like if a set comes turning around and kind of trying to get back into the impact zone away from that area. So that was really a shock when I arrived there.
Wow. That is a great description and a scary description. I did have that concept that you could just kind of sit wide. I had a listener question that relates to this, and it's my friend Ben at Associated Surf Picks asked, how do you pick the good waves? And he said, especially with priority, and I think he's meaning just, that you're next up. How do you pick the good waves, and can you see them? Can you read them?
Well, so let me answer that in two parts. One in terms of priority and the other people, and the other in terms of just the wave itself. So you can very broadly, and of course this is a generalization, but there's three kinds of waves that come in at Teahupoo. There's the ones that kind of come out the north and really peel down the reef. And then there's the ones that come in from the west, come in from the side, and really stand up on that famous end bowl that you see. And then there's the ones that have kind of got a little bit of both in them. If you pick the north ones, it can actually be kind of sounds funny to say, but kind of a softer, mellower wave. You can get waves with a lot of north in them where they don't even touch that big, heavy west end bowl. And especially on a head-high day, you could be going out there, and none of the locals are out there on a head-high day. They're not really that bothered, and no one's flying into surf it on a head-high day. So if you've got a north swell on a head-high day, you can surf these fun little left-hand waves at Teahupoo all day long and be doing turns and everything. Then when you get these west ones coming in, sometimes if you're sitting up the reef, you can't even catch them because there's nothing there. It's literally just one big west slab that just stands up. And most of the time people let those ones go just because it's very difficult to actually get into them, even for the guys that have got the place really wired. So the ones that you really look for are the ones that have got enough north in it that it's standing up higher up the reef to get over the ledge, but have got enough west in them that they're really barreling and giving that classic Teahupoo heavy barrel when they hit the end of the wave. And in terms of picking the right ones, it's funny because something we work on a lot at Surf Simile is wave selection and the ability to predict waves, And I remember sitting out at Teahupoo one time, and it's all happened so fast. The wave appears so quickly. You have so little time because it's such deep water going to such shallow water that I've got my adrenaline going and my hands shaking, and I'm trying to make these split-second decisions about which is the right wave to go on, where to be, and who's got priority. And I remember John was just sitting like a little down the reef, and he's just having a casual conversation with his buddy about what they watched on TV last night. And he just pauses mid-sentence, turns around, does 2 paddles, and he suddenly like stood inside the barrel and kicking out the end to carry on talking about whatever show on Netflix they were talking about. And I mean, it just suddenly made me realize the level of ability to predict waves based on how they look when they're far out with those top guys is just absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, great description. Appreciate that. And I think I want to maybe take that a little further and ask you, you know, what the drop is like. Walk us through that actual drop.
So, you know, obviously it's a left, but actually when you're trying to get over the ledge, you want to have your board angled slightly to the right, actually pointing back in towards, you know, the closeout the wrong way. Because if you have any angle on your board at all, as the wave bends in at you, your board is then going to be sideways to the wave and it's going to be getting pitched by the lip sideways rather than dropping down the face and having your rail engage. So it's a bizarre feeling that you really want to have your board angled to the right, kind of doing a right hand angle takeoff. And then as soon as you're over that ledge, as soon as you know that you're not going to get caught up in the lip, you need to transition and put all of your weight immediately on that left hand rail so that you're, you know, obviously so that you're not going too far down the wave and that you're getting going. And, you know, my experience the first few times I surfed there, excuse me, and quite frankly, most of the time when I surf there today is taking off, you know, too deep and getting stuck deep inside that barrel, or taking off a little too wide and being aware that the barrel is really going, but that you're a couple of meters in front of it and feeling like you're king of the world, only to look up at, you know, whoever your boat driver is, how manner, looking back at you, shaking their head in disappointment.
I don't know how it is there with it. Well, first, I had another listener question that was concerning the locals. Domingos asked, are the locals nice to non-locals? Just tell us about the crowd factor there at Teahupoo.
Well, so again, my experience of it has been that the locals are the most kind and respectful and respected locals that I've ever seen anywhere. Now, I know that in other parts of Tahiti, the localism is quite fierce. My understanding from just the local people I've talked to is that Ray Mana was a big part of trying to create a culture at Teahupoo specifically, which was friendly to foreign surfers. I know that particularly in recent years, on the small tow days, it's got totally packed out with people who are trying to get that photo of them in that one towable wave at Teahupoo. I haven't surfed it on those days. The days that I really enjoy are sort of the medium-sized paddle days, you know. And on those days, it's just the most fun place to surf that I've ever been, honestly, because a lot of those locals, they're pretty relaxed about those days and getting waves. You don't tend to get a lot of intermediate surfers going there to surf it because it's Teahupoo. So you can actually have like head to 1.5 times overhead, really fun barrels all day long. And I had the experience the first time I went there of Matehei Drole and another guy called Mateheu, who I'm probably saying his name wrong, the second guy. But I remember sitting out in the water and they paddled over, and there's probably like 10 guys sitting in the water, and they paddled over and said hello to everyone, like, hi, I'm Matehei, how's it going? You know, and then they paddle up to where they want to sit, and then they didn't take all the waves they could. But they would certainly take the best ones. And I just, you know, I've surfed in a lot of places around the world and dealt with a lot of locals and non-locals who like to think of themselves as the big dog, you know, barking at everyone and taking everything they can, which is not how I think priority should work. And I thought those guys, in particular, Matehei, were just a perfect role model of how locals should behave to be absolutely respected and gracious at the same time. Yeah, so I think it's a very special place. Now, that may change, of course, in future as it gets busier. I imagine enough pressure changes any situation, but that's been my experience there. Really magical.
I think Raimana and Matehei need to come visit Southern California and bring some of that energy for sure. I was wondering let's stay with them for a moment. I was wondering what the best surfing was that you saw out there. And, well, yeah, tell me about one of the best sessions you saw in the pros that were surfing it.
So I think the first time that I went there, we had one big day quite at the end. Again, just paddle big, not toe big.
Right.
And John was out there making it look very easy. And Matahei Drolle, one of the locals who your listeners will have seen if they Google him, towing in on the biggest days out there. Yeah. And again, those guys are just so kind of casual. And it's funny, actually, on those days with those sets coming in, quite a few of the locals who just drive the boats and don't even really consider themselves surfers, they just drive the boats at Teahupoo and like to jump in the water now and again, are so comfortable in double overhead Teahupoo and don't really surf anywhere else. They just do that one thing, and it's quite extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is a special wave, and when you watch it on an event or on TV or on a video, I noticed that it's a little different from pipe in that the end section seems to bend, and you did a really great job of talking about the reef and how that all works. But that bend in the wave, when you get tubed, is that something that you compensate for, or you just ride the tube as normal and you come out after that? You understand what I'm saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, that's one of the things I love about surfing there, because when you take off, it feels like you're so impossibly deep. But because the wave bends towards you, the exit comes towards you, and actually that makes the barrel wider too. In terms of the line that you draw, I mean, your listeners who, like me, probably surf just regular everyday beach break waves that barrel occasionally, you usually find yourself kind of drawing quite a high line in the barrel, because the barrel happens in like the top third of the wave usually.
Right.
And when you've got a wave that's bending as much as that, it's shocking how much you need to point your board down the wave into the trough, almost as if you're straightening out, right? Wow. But then actually that's the right line to draw with the wave bending in towards you. So for me, it took a little bit of getting used to knowing how much lower to point my board down the wave and how much more to point it in towards the shore than I would riding a sort of a more like everyday barrel, let's say.
Yeah, I'm wondering, taking that I don't know, have you ever surfed the North Shore? Have you ever surfed pipe or any of that?
I have a couple of times. I wouldn't say that I've been out on pipe when it's what your listeners probably think of as pipe, but yeah, I think paddle around there.
Yeah, I think what I'm getting at there is, do those skills translate? Because one of the things that we do is we break down fantasy surfing, and we want to pick who we think is great at pipe. Do you think those skills translate?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you more often see pipe from the front because it's easier to film it from the beach, and you more often see Teahupoo from the side because it's easier to film it from the channel, and it actually really warps our perception of what all waves all over the world are like, based on where it's most convenient to film it from. Just as another example, the Cloudbreak, where I've surfed quite a lot as well, one of the boatmen pointed out to me on a recent trip there, like, if you approached Cloudbreak from the front instead of from the side, half the people wouldn't paddle out on the days they paddle out on, because you're looking in from the side and it looks like this lovely barrel. And the reason I mention that is, pipe really is a super heavy wave, and we think of Teahupoo perhaps as the viewing public as being heavier because we're used to seeing how it folds over from the side, whereas we see pipe from the front. But I mean, pipe is also a kind of wave where, especially when they get those really bowly ones where the board's pointing down the face, and it really is unloading with, I mean, pretty close to the same kind of weight that Teahupoo is. So they're not as different as you might think from just watching them on the webcast.
It's good to hear that. You described the drop really well, and I'm wondering, of those three waves that you mentioned, Cloudbreak, Teahupoo, and pipe, put those in order of the most difficult drop.
Oof. Well, Cloudbreak is actually a fairly easy drop. I mean, I say that, it depends which one you get and where you take off on it. But Cloudbreak, you can kind of take off right up at the top of the reef and do a pretty mellow roll in. And then if you're there on kind of an average head high to double overhead day with a big crew, everyone's taking off at the top and having a lot of fun. And the difference between the really high level surfers and the lower level surfers isn't the takeoff, it's like how long you stay in it, because it's that inside section that starts to get really heavy. And what really takes guts at Cloudbreak is to stay with the wave as it gets heavier and steeper on that inside shish kebab section. Teahupoo by contrast, that takeoff is everything. If you can get over the ledge, get your rail engaged, and you've picked the right wave, then the easier part is navigating your way through that west bowl right at the edge. So they're almost like the reverse of each other. I found Cloudbreak a much more kind of relaxing, enjoyable experience, whereas Teahupoo still has my nerves jangling, even when I think about going out there. It's funny, I'll leave you with this thought. On both the trips I've done to Teahupoo, I've gone through this weird mental circle in my head at night where I'll lie there in bed and I think, okay, I'm actually really scared about surfing tomorrow. And then I say to myself, you know what? You don't have to surf it. If it's big and it's heavy and you're intimidated, there's no one's got a gun to your head. You've got nothing to prove. You don't have to surf it. And then I relax and I think, all right, I won't surf it if it's big. And then I imagine myself on the plane home going, what if you didn't surf it? How much are you going to hate yourself? You should just definitely surf it, whatever. And then I find myself right back where I started until I didn't sleep all night, just kind of going round and round in a circle.
I think one of the hard parts about surfing it and motivating yourself is the consequences. I want to hear, what the bottom's like and what a wipeout is like. I'm sure you probably hit that reef. Tell me about that.
I mean, there's so much luck. It's every wipeout is kind of like a game of Russian roulette. You can go over the falls on the gnarliest looking waves and come up fine and sort of surprised at how okay you are. And equally, you can go over on quite a small one, just a little bit awkwardly, and just happen to connect with that bit of reef in an unlucky way. The last time I was out there, I was out there with one of the coaches from Surf Simply, Gabriel Vargas, and we lucked out on this. Probably the best I've ever surfed it. In the middle of the day, the wind had come up and a lot of people had gone in, and then the wind dropped off. We had a few hours before our flight. There was probably like 4 or 5 people out there. Overhead waves, perfect barrels. My friend Gabriel just caught his rail on the end of one of the last ones and just snagged his head on a bit of reef and then split the whole side of his head open. So we had to, take him into the hospital. The boat drivers there were super great. We got him in, we drove him to the hospital, got him stitched up. But it wasn't a big wave. He'd surfed much bigger waves the whole trip. It was just unlucky. You're spinning around underwater. You've got that really shallow coral reef with just random bits that are an inch higher than another. And the difference between missing by an inch and not missing by an inch is the difference between a trip to hospital versus, just another trip back out for another wave. And I think wearing helmets is a really, really good idea out there. I'm quite sure that one day people will look back on people surfing Teahupoo without a helmet the way that we look at people smoking in offices now and just think it's completely crazy.
I totally agree with that. I can't believe they're not wearing helmets more. And you're starting to see that get traction at Pipeline. And I think it's a good idea. I have a scar on my head to prove that. But hey, lastly, I wanted to ask you, or just have you tell us some magical story from Teahupoo. It doesn't have to be in the water, but it can be.
Yeah, well, I mean, on my last day of my last trip there, I was really excited. I knew the surf was going to be really good, and our boat driver was going to come and meet us at our house at 5 a.m. in the dark to take us out there. And I was kind of frothing, and he didn't show up. And I was just like, I've got to get out there. So I paddled from our house all the way out to the reef. We were staying right on the point. If you paddle from the shore, it's actually just under 1,000 arm stroke paddles, because we counted them one day to get from the shore to the takeoff spot. So 998 paddles later, I'm right there on the takeoff spot, and it's kind of dark, and there's one other guy out, and I can hardly see anything. And this big west one comes in that I probably wouldn't have gone on, except that I knew it was my last day, and I didn't know if there's any more sets going to come. I immediately went over the falls, and I came up, and my leash had come off, and I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? No leash, it's dark, there's no one else out here. My board was right next to me after a pretty solid wipeout. So, I said, you never know what's going to happen. It was right there. I got on the board, paddled back out, got another one, board snapped on the next wave. I paddled half the board all the way back into the shore, by which time the boat driver had got there, got on the boat, came back out with my friends, went over on the next wave, broke my board again, went all the way back in, got my other board, came back out, got the wave of my life. So that was my last session there last year. And that was a pretty special day.
Magic. Hey, you guys, if you want instruction from pros and technical instruction, check out Surf Simply. You can tell that Rue's the guy that you want doing that. I really appreciate it. That was top level. And hey, thanks for your time, man.
It's a real pleasure to be on the show, and I love what you do. It's fabulous. I love your channel. It's great.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that.